What brings you to us?
You know you're watching a Darren Aronofsky film if we witness the downfall of an ambitious, obsessive protagonist. Darren Aronofsky's dark, gripping films focus on ambition and obsession and the psychological torment that results from both. At first glance, his protagonists seem disparate in nature. A mathematician, a group of drug addicts, a surgeon, a wrestler, a ballet dancer, and a prominent biblical figure. Yet all of these characters strive for greatness and often fly too close to the sun. The very thing they yearn to do, like wrestle or dance, leads to their breakdown. Each film can be described as a character study, taking a deep dive into the inner psyche of a creative yet disturbed individual. Often intelligent and creative people, they walk a fine line between inspired and insane.
This is insanity, Max.
Or maybe it's genius.
As they search for meaning or purpose in their life. Beware, this video contains spoilers. This ambition is exemplified in Aronofsky's first film, the $68,000 budget Pi, which won him Best Director at Sundance in 1998. It chronicles mathematician Max Cohen's paranoid quest to find a single number that will give order to the universe.
Mathematics is the language of nature.
On this quest to prove that order exists, Max ends up demonstrating the opposite as the chaotic world drives him insane. The low-budget debut was a precursor of what was to come, as Aronofsky's protagonists would continue to be driven by an insatiable need for meaning.
I'm not interested in your money. I'm looking for a way to understand our world.
The self-destructive drive persists throughout his filmography, especially in The Wrestler and Black Swan, which many people often view as a pair of films about creativity. Both films' protagonists pursue a dream that we know will crush them in the end. After a brief attempt at living a normal life, Randy returns to wrestling knowing that his heart may give out. In the end, he'd rather die doing what he loves than live doing what he hates.
You hear them? This is where I belong.
Likewise, Nina foresees the psychological breakdown that will occur if she pursues the role of the Black Swan, both in her opening dream and in watching her company's previous prima ballerina, Beth. But it doesn't matter to Nina, because she's willing to give up her sanity to get what she wants.
I can't handle this! I can't! I'm the Swan Queen. You're the one who never left the Corps.
Aronofsky observes that to reach our potential, we sometimes must destroy ourselves in the process. Aronofsky's characters often construct an elaborate fantasy to shield themselves from the horrors and uncertainties of their real worlds. In Requiem for a Dream, the characters suffering from addiction escape into dreams to distract from their painful reality. Harry fantasizes about growing old with Marion. Marion dreams of pursuing a career in fashion design, and Sarah believes she'll be on TV.
It's a reason to get up in the morning. It's a reason to smile. It makes tomorrow all right.
The fantasies of both Harry and his mother are symbolized by the red dress, which embodies the ideal image they think they want for their lives. But in reality, they're addicted to the escape of these fantasies more than they truly want the life they picture at the end of that pier. Over the course of the film, the red dress transforms from a symbol of hope into a symbol of darkness, as his characters' dreams collapse under the weight of their crippling addictions.
Can you come today?
I'll come today. You just wait for me, all right?
Aronofsky observes that we sometimes need fantasies to continue living, or life would be too unbearable. Tragically, at the end, they tell themselves that everything is going to be okay, because they know it won't. In The Fountain, Aronofsky shows characters embracing a fantasy for a different purpose, to deal with the unknown and achieve peace. Izzy writes a book about Spanish conquistadors searching for the mythical fountain of youth to help herself and her husband Tommy cope with her eventual death from cancer. Aronofsky has said instead of facing this tragedy in terror, she is coming to terms with what is happening to her. And the film represents the director's own spiritual beliefs. He has gone on record that, quote, "My biggest expression of what I believe is in The Fountain." Aronofsky, like all of us, doesn't know what comes after death, but he believes in the value of these fantasies and stories we tell ourselves to cope with the uncertain. These stories that we invent are his religion. After all, it's the basis of his art and his living. For Aronofsky, though, these stories or beliefs aren't necessarily always comforting or happy. His retelling of the biblical Great Flood in Noah is brutal and dark, questioning the nature of humanity and capturing the way in which the Old Testament contains violent, disturbing material that denies denies us easy comfort and answers. But even if they are this disturbing, our need for stories and dreams is as deep as our need for meaning itself. Aronofsky's films can be seen as a cinematic parallel to the Expressionist art movement. At the turn of the century, Expressionist painters sought to illustrate the conflict between surface-level beauty and deeply felt internal turmoil and insecurity. Aronofsky has referred to himself as an Expressionist, saying, quote, "Stylistically, I try to be an Expressionist to use the camera to push the emotion of the scene. That's the goal, to marry style with performance." Rather than with oil paints and a canvas, the director uses his expressive camera to express the inner lives of his characters and visualize what can't be seen. Aronofsky shoots his films so that we view the world through the subjective eyes of his protagonists. He achieves this with first-person cinematic techniques like tracking shots, point-of-view shots, and immersive sound, giving us the impression that we're experiencing the events of the film firsthand with them. But he then pushes this further by showing us hallucinations and imaginations created by their minds, leading us to question their sanity and bringing us into their fantasy worlds. In Requiem for a Dream, we see Aronofsky's deliberate use of expressive camera when he uses a split screen to show Harry and Marion talking to each other in bed. The characters are physically close, next to each other, so the totally unnecessary use of split screen is to make the viewer aware of the invisible divide that exists between these two characters. Even at this point, they're not really seeing each other, but their own dreams and illusions brought about by their highs. As their addiction worsens, it becomes even more clear that they both need drugs more than each other. Aronofsky also uses the split screen earlier in the film to demonstrate the divide between Harry and his mother, who can't see past her long-standing ideas of her son to face his addiction for what it is. At some points early in the film, Aronofsky will let a scene play out before cutting and revealing to us that it's been an imagination. This occurs when Harry imagines stealing a gun from a police officer, or when Marion imagines stabbing her shrink in the hand with a fork. These scenes feed into the later film, because when Harry gets his arm amputated, or when Marion is forced to prostitute herself, we expect and want Aronofsky to cut away, telling us it's just been a fiction. But he doesn't. Instead, we're denied the addict's escape, and we're forced to remain in the devastating reality of what's really happening to these characters. Nina's warped perception of reality in Black Swan forces the viewer to decide what is and isn't objectively happening, and by the end, her fantasy has become the entire world that we see. Like in Black Swan, in Pi, Aronofsky places the viewer firmly in the mind of the protagonist, using surrealist imagery to show us Max's headspace. He begins imagining a rotting brain in a subway station. This is a literal manifestation of his fear that he's going insane, that his brain will rot. Whereas Nina's hallucinations of another her express her fear of an alternate, destructive self taking over. Aronofsky often shoots his characters looking into mirrors, again to demonstrate that expressionistic conflict between external beauty and internal turmoil. In Black Swan, Aronofsky's expressionist tendencies are on full display, as mirrors are constantly present. A ballet dancer's entire career and art hinges on their external appearance. As the film progresses, she keeps looking into mirrors to make sure that her internal unraveling doesn't leak into her external appearance. The mirror also reminds us of her duality, both between inner and outer selves, and the black and white swan. And this mirror shot expresses the danger of fractured or multiple selves. The conflict between external and internal also shows up in Requiem for a Dream. In one scene, Tyrone stands in front of some mirrors, admiring his external appearance.
Right now I'm grooving with these new mirrors I got.
Before being swept away in a daydream, melancholically remembering a childhood moment with his mother. The memory is triggered in part because his external appearance is at odds with his inner distress. On the outside, he looks in good physical shape, but on the inside, he knows that drugs have taken a hold of his body and his life, and that he's disappointed his mother. Aronofsky illustrates that allowing our inner and outer selves to disconnect from each other leads to misery and madness. A key scene featuring strobe lighting often signifies the moment when the character's inner strife finally manifests itself externally or physically. In Pi, the lights begin flickering in Max's apartment before he decides to drill into his skull. It's the moment when the internal and the external merge. His psychological distress can now be objectively seen and leads him to damage his body. Likewise, in The Wrestler, lights flash as Randy exits the ring after a particularly brutal match. and soon his repressed knowledge that he's too old to keep wrestling translates physically into a heart attack. In Black Swan, the club scene is when Nina first outwardly expresses and acknowledges her sexual desire. In all of these scenes, the strobe light expresses the character's world-shattering realization, and it signals that their inner distress has now entered the outer world and become physical. Like his subjective camera, the sound design in Aronofsky's films is especially prominent because it tells us what the characters hear or feel, whether they're doing drugs, using a computer, making money, waking up, or eating breakfast. These sounds bring us into the characters' inner worlds. And they also give his films a noticeable rhythm, which keeps the viewer on edge. Aronofsky often explores extreme parent-child dynamics in his films.
You know, as a parent, you can really understand that. If you're too just with your child and you're too strict, then you can really mess up your child. If you're too merciful with your child, then they don't learn a lesson and it could go bad in another way. So being a good parent is having a good balance of justice and mercy.
In this way, 2017's Mother, with its echoes of Rosemary's Baby, ties into Aronofsky's other work, as throughout his films we've seen parent figures who are separated from their children by various delusions, seeing their own distorted visions of a child instead of who that child really is. In Requiem for a Dream, Harry's mother is seemingly driven to addiction and insanity by aspirations to be on TV, but these delusions grow because of her son's neglect. He rarely visits her, and when he does, she's unable to face the signs that addiction has taken over his life.
This isn't happening. And if it should be happening, it would be all right.
So she retreats into her fantasy to avoid acknowledging his absence and his addiction. All of the outward conflicts and plot in The Black Swan can likewise arguably be interpreted as expressions of a central parent-child conflict. Nina's bitter, repressive mother gave up ballet to raise her daughter and is now obsessed with Nina's ballet career and trapping her in the childlike state we see Nina start to rebel against. Noah portrays a father whose cruel actions in the name of God result in a falling out between him and his son. The story seems to draw from the biblical tale of Abraham and Isaac, but it's again getting at this issue of parents who see their children through the filter of a greater desire or belief that has nothing to do with that child as an individual. Aronofsky's melodrama and psychological horror tends to extend from a core story that's based in these real family conflicts. Throughout his films, Aronofsky places the viewer in the mindset of someone experiencing psychological distress, self-doubt, and isolation. He uses his trademark expressive imagery and subjective camera techniques to flesh out the stories of marginal, creative people as they experience universal struggles with darkness.
The only person standing in your way is you. It's time to let her go.